What if the most dangerous species in the galaxy didn't need to move a muscle to win? A forgotten human engineer just sat in silence and shattered every alien empire's ego. You won't believe how he did it, or why he walked away from absolute power. Stick around. This changes everything you thought you knew about humanity. The stars outside were long dead. Once, this stretch of space now called the Calderon wreck burned with the brilliance of young suns. Now, only their remnants floated like ash, silent and cold. Somewhere in that cosmic graveyard drifted Orion's fold, a diplomatic station built from desperation and denial. It spun slowly in zero-grav silence, a monument to what remained of interstellar civility. Inside, it wasn't much better. The grand chamber of delegates buzzed with overlapping languages, some spoken, others pulsed, some flickering across bioluminescent skin. 16 species had come to claim Calderon 6, the last untouched planet in the sector. Calderon 6 wasn't just rich in oxygen and life, it was inscarred. That made it sacred, or to some, ripe for the taking. The chamber, dome-shaped and surrounded by shimmering atmospheric membranes, tried to equalize everything: gravity, scent, sound, temperature. But nothing could equalize tension. Delegates perched, hovered, or coiled in their respective platforms, glaring at each other through rows of compound eyes, sonar waves, and glassy sensors. No one noticed the human sitting near the back. He didn't speak, didn't fidget, just sat on a utility bench, arms folded, cap pulled low over dark, tired eyes. His name tag read Renn, Elias Maintenance Ops. Though the LED panel beneath it had long since glitched out, he wasn't supposed to be here. He was a tech, a grease under the fingernails, last to be called kind of guy, assigned to monitor biosystem calibration for the conference. The only reason he hadn't been cleared out was because no one had remembered he was there in the first place. He liked it that way. 100 voices rose in accusation and rebuttal. The Laron matriarch hissed that her species seeded Calderon first. The Glavican hive shrieked sonic bursts encoded with historical claims. The Vernari's diplomats blinked a legal treaty through their skin in Morse-like pulses. The noise reached a fever pitch as the Grand Arbiter of the Zentheria 12-foot tower of resin and fire slammed its staff to the floor. Enough, it thundered. Voice processed through a 6-channel reverb. If no consensus is reached, Calderon 6 shall be quarantined and mined by the Folds Consortium. Outrage followed, shouts, threats. A thin coil of acidic mist erupted from the Mephire's side of the chamber. Someone, maybe the Jalari, answered with a directed ion pulse. Security drones flared awake in warning mode. That's when Elias stood. At first, no one noticed. He wasn't glowing. He wasn't screeching. He didn't even clear his throat. He just walked forward, boots clicking against the polished alloy floor. And then, the silence followed him. Like a wave breaking through chaos, 16 pairs of eyes, organic and artificial, turned toward the man in the faded jacket and patchy utility pants. The Arbiter stared down at him. Identify. Elias didn't blink. Elias Renn, maintenance. Confusion rippled through the crowd. You are not authorized to speak. Probably not, Elias agreed. But I'm speaking anyway. The Arbiter's flame flickered dangerously. Elias took another step forward. You all want Calderon 6. You're willing to scream, fight, maybe burn the only green world left to ash just so the others don't get it first. A few growled. A few blinked. One pulsed in passive-aggressive colors. I have a better idea, Elias said, calm as still water. A game. No weapons, no speeches, no politics. He pulled a small disc from his coat and set it on the floor. It blinked once, projecting a faint blue glow. A silence contest. Now he had their full attention. Not respect, not trust, but something better: confusion. You heard me, he said. Everyone joins. No movement, no sound, no displays, no tech, just silence. Stillness. The first one to break it loses. The last one standing wins. The room froze. Elias looked around the chamber at the apex predators, the living software, the hive minds, the war heroes. And then he smiled. Let's see who really deserves the last living world. The silence after Elias's challenge wasn't peaceful. It was electric, taut, dangerous, alive with the kind of tension you only get right before someone throws a punch, or a planet Delegates exchanged glances, data packets, pheromones, and thought bursts. Some snorted, some shimmered in amusement, others simply blinked, trying to process what they just heard. The arbiter's voice, when it returned, was dipped in contempt. "You suggest a child's game?" Elias tilted his head. "Sometimes children's games are the truest tests. No weapons, no advantage, no manipulation. Just patience, endurance." The Jolari ambassador pulsed a sequence of clicks into her translation pod. "This is absurd. You can't possibly expect Apex minds to waste cycles on silence." "Then don't join," Elias said, hands in his pockets. "But if you leave, you forfeit any claim to Calderon 6. That's the wager. You stay, you play. You win, you decide the future. You lose, you sit this one out." Whispers, murmurs, a few outright scoffs. The Voshek delegate, which resembled a sphere of molten metal encased in a kinetic containment shell, rotated ominously. "And what proof do we have that you will not cheat, or use technology to suppress biological impulses?" Elias nodded toward the chamber's neural grid above. "The Fold surveillance system is already watching. Biofeedback, motion, sound, anything out of baseline gets flagged and disqualifies you instantly. Do you want transparency? You've got it." A few delegates turned toward the chamber's central AI relay, silently confirming the claim. The Synthery, a being composed entirely of reflective crystal, pulsed a question directly to the system. The answer returned: all biological and cognitive metrics could be monitored in real time. Perfect enforcement. Still, no one moved. Then, a soft rustle like dry leaves caught in a breeze. The Mycalian representative stepped forward, its fungal form shifting in slow waves. "We accept. Silence is natural to us." Another pause. Then two more delegates joined. Then 5. Eventually, 16 species stood or floated, or hovered in a rough circle around the glowing disk Elias had placed. The chamber lights dimmed to prevent ocular strain. The timer activated, hovering in the air 0 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds. Elias sat cross-legged, hands resting on his knees. Then, the timer began. 0 hours 15 minutes and 32 seconds. The first quarter hour passed easily. Most species were either advanced enough to suppress basic reflexes, or too proud to admit discomfort, the Mephrey cloud being simply dispersed into a slow swirl. The Jolari sang silence through their bodies, a kind of anti-hum that pushed back against the air. The Vaya, a crystalline intelligence, froze entirely, locking their refractive cores into stillness. But Elias just breathed. Slow, controlled, as if the chaos of the room didn't exist. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that he'd done this before. Flashback. 30 years earlier, it had been a deep space mining transport, outbound from Epsilon Prime. Elias had been the youngest engineer aboard, 22, idealistic, undertrained. When the ship's hull ruptured during a solar flare, he'd been the only survivor. He ejected into the atmosphere of Calderon-6. Survival wasn't heroic. It was muddy, desperate, and humiliating. He'd found shelter beneath the massive shell fungus of a canyon wall. For 22 days, he hadn't spoken, hadn't moved beyond the barest survival instinct. A predator, something with too many legs and too many eyes, had tracked him for most of that time. It waited for movement. So Elias waited longer. The fungus shielded his heat signature. The predator eventually gave up. Elias didn't. He waited 3 more days, just to be sure. When rescue came, he didn't rejoice. He didn't even speak. He'd learned then that survival wasn't about strength or brilliance. It was about stillness. 1 hour 10 minutes and 57 seconds back in the chamber, the game continued. One delegate, an aquatic species relying on constant gill movement, was disqualified quietly when its respiration exceeded baseline. The system pinged red. Its platform retracted automatically. No one flinched. Another was removed after a subdermal heat spike registered as a form of stress response. Gone. Still, Elias didn't blink. The Via flickered slightly. The synthery dimmed for a half second. Elias didn't move. Inside his head, he recited something his mother used to say back on Earth. Still water cuts deepest. Not because it's loud, but because it lasts. 2 hours 43 minutes and 18 seconds. The Jolari cracked. Their natural harmony, sustained only through psychic balance, had begun to wobble. A soft, involuntary hum escaped. That was enough. Disqualified. Another platform dim. Of 16, only 11 remained. The orbiter glanced at Elias, whose heart rate remained annoyingly stable. He's not even evolved. The orbiter barked in disgust. No secondary cortex. And no neuroflex redundancy. Just meat and stubbornness. Elias didn't even smile, because this wasn't about outsmarting anyone. This was about being the last thing still breathing when everything else gave up. And that was something humans did best. The silence had become something else entirely. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore, it was weight. A pressure that settled into the neural pathways of those who could feel. And even those who couldn't. A few species began exhibiting signs of neurological strain. Pulses flickered offbeat. Photonic rhythms desynchronized. A low-level hum began to echo in the chamber, not from voices, but from the system's compensators straining to stabilize the energy fields around beings that were beginning to falter. Of the original 16, only 8 remained. The mycelium had shed its outer layer entirely, collapsing into a pile of inert spores. The Mephire's ambient cloud had destabilized and was now contained in an isolation field. The synthery crystal was still upright, but fractures had begun to appear along its lower core, fine lines spidering outward like stress fractures on glass. The Jalari, whose language required near constant jaw twitching and eye flickering to regulate brain function, had managed nearly 4 hours before their facial membrane spasmed involuntarily. A single blink too many. Disqualified. And still Elias didn't move. He sat with his back straight, hands resting on his knees, eyes closed now, not in arrogance, not in meditation, but in conservation. His breathing remained deep and even, his vitals barely fluctuating. The human's endurance had become unsettling. That's when the accusations began. A soft chime broke the silence, a signal override from the orbiter. This has gone on long enough, it boomed, voice crackling with restrained hostility. I accuse humans of covert augmentation. No being of such primitive composition can remain still for this long unaided. A murmur, visual, telepathic, and otherwise, rippled through the remaining delegates. Conduct a scan. The orbiter snapped. Full spectrum. If he is cheating, he forfeits. If not, I withdraw from this farce. The chamber's AI interface lit up, casting beams of soft light across Elias's body. Blue lines traced his limbs. Paused at key pressure points, then scanned beneath the skin. Neuroconductivity, muscle tension, hormonal output. Silence reigned once more as data streamed into the observation net. After 21 seconds, the system spoke. Subject Elias Renn. No augmentations detected. No motion recorded. No irregularity present. Compliance total. The orbiter's flames flared, then dimmed in submission. It sat back slowly, its molten eyes narrowing. Elias did not so much as twitch in response. He hadn't even opened his eyes. 05:5 to 4 for the visa shattered. It began as a single harmonic spike, a note just off-key, resonating through its refractive shell. Then a ripple, like a bell being struck too hard. Without warning, the core cracked with a high-pitched whine and collapsed inward. Shards of transparent matter scattered across its containment field. The via vanished in a puff of dispersal. Mist. 7 remained. One of the synthery tried to recalibrate its inner prism, but the very act of attempting, though internal, registered as a cognitive movement. The system flagged it immediately. Disqualified. 6. The E3 delegate, a creature composed of sentient plasma, began to dim rapidly. Their form flickered and surged as internal equilibrium destabilized, though they didn't move. Their radiant frequency surged past acceptable variance. Gone. 5. By now, the delegates weren't just still, they were suffering. The silence had stretched into something unnatural. For creatures of vast intelligence, of complex systems and sensory overload, this was torture. This was starvation. A psychic scream burst from the Vernari, unintentional, but undeniable. The chamber lights pulsed red. Disqualified. For Elias remained. There was something unsettling about the way he sat there. No strain, no cracks, no twitch. Just presence, and moving, and flinching. And yet, the chamber began to feel cold around him. Mini twist. High above, in the observation array, an anomaly flickered. One of the chamber technicians, an insectoid from the Volux species, narrowed its compound eyes. It leaned closer to the biometric readout labeled Renn Elias. Heart rate steady. Brainwave activity slowed but stable. All within human limits. But something was odd. Every other species had fluctuated visibly, detectably as the game wore on. Elias, his data had barely moved at all. To stable. Could he be suppressing his data? The technician wondered aloud. The system flagged the question and ran a diagnostic. Result: no artificial suppression detected. Source: biological. Pattern: consistent with stress-adapted trauma response. In other words, this wasn't abnormal. Was learned. Condition. He single quotes done this before. 6 hours 48 minutes and 9 seconds. The chamber was nearly empty. Only Elias and 2 others remained, the arbiter of the Zenthari, and Osferin, a being of photonic mist and refracted light. The Zenthari still sat, rigid, but sparks of unstable fusion rippled beneath its molten core. Its staff trembled slightly in its grip, and Osferin pulsed faintly, barely noticeable. Its form shimmered at the edges, like a dying sun flickering. Behind a veil. Elias remained still, a mountain, a ghost, a memory that refused to fade. No one noticed the faint upward twitch at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't just enduring anymore. He was waiting. 11 hours 22 minutes and 51 seconds. The chamber had grown impossibly still. So still that even the eye's ambient hum had dialed itself down to nothing. Lights dimmed to a low, bluish hue, casting long shadows across the reflective floor. No one moved. No one dared. 3 remained. The Zenthari arbiter sat like a dying star, core burning too hot, too long. Its obsidian armor had begun to crack, hairline fractures splitting outward from the center of its chest. Glowing fissures leaked raw energy, as if the very act of containing itself was now tearing it apart. And then there was Osferin. The photonic entity floated midair. Its shimmering form now dull and unstable, once a beacon of elegance and motionless grace, it now trembled with a faint, stuttering pulse like a candle flickering in vacuum. No facial features, no mouth, but if you stared long enough, you could almost feel it pleading. The timer tick. 11 hours 29 minutes and 14 seconds. A sharp sound like the chime of shattered glass hitting the floor cracked through the silence. The arbiter's core exploded inward with a soundless implosion. A shockwave of light burst out and vanished, as the Zenthari's molten form collapsed into slag, still steaming within its containment field. Disqualified. The platform dimmed, only to remain. Osferin and Elias. Elias didn't react, not a blink, not a breath out of place. The others watched what few remained. The once crowded chamber was now lined with empty seats. Collapsed avatars, flickering projectors, species that had mastered time, energy, death. All undone by stillness. 11 hours 47 minutes and 2 seconds. Osferin flickered. Once. Twice. Then its form pulsed outward suddenly, like a wave collapsing back into itself. Its outer corona flared in a brief, stunning burst of blue light and then folded inward. A soft shudder of quantum light gone, the last shimmer of the wave being vanished into a single point of nothing. Only one being remained. 11 hours 47 minutes and 8 seconds. Elias opened his eyes. They were calm, not triumphant, not relieved, just a calm. He blinked once, exhaled through his nose. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stood. His knees didn't buckle, his back didn't crack. He stood like someone who had always been waiting for this moment. The chamber watched in total silence. Elias glanced at the still-running timer floating overhead. 11 hours 47 minutes and 9 seconds. 11 hours 47 minutes and 10 seconds. Then he reached out and pressed his thumb to the disk he had placed nearly 12 hours ago. The timer stopped. Demonstration complete. I said aloud. No one spoke. Not a single delegate moved. Because for the first time in their evolutionary memory, they were afraid. Not of weapons, not of war, but of a species who could sit in absolute silence longer than any other had ever dreamed. Elias turned to face them. I didn't win, he said simply, his voice just above a whisper, yet cutting through the stillness like a blade. I endured. He scanned the empty seats, the disqualified avatars, the burned-out shell of the Zenthari arbiter. This isn't about power, he said. It's about patience, about who's willing to wait. and wait. And keep waiting long after everyone else has left. He stepped back from the circle. I represent a species you thought was weak, soft, primitive. He raised his eyes, dark, steady. But we outlive, we outwait, we outlast. And then, with deliberate finality, he sat back down on his bench. In the corner, same place as before. Silent, still, and shaken. And the galaxy finally understood what persistence really meant. The silence that followed Elias's final words wasn't just the echo of it was surrender. One by one, the few remaining delegates rematerialized, not to challenge, not to protest, but to listen. A being of molten gas from the Vashek drifted closer, crackling softly. The arbiter's throne sat empty, still leaking heat. The chamber hummed gently in passive mode, as if uncertain how to proceed. Everyone expected the next words to be political. They assumed Elias would lay claim to Calderon 6 on behalf of Earth. That he would demand mining rights, territory, power, anything to justify the trial they'd just endured. But he did in single quotes instead. He stood again, no fanfare, no amplification, and said, "We don't want Calderon 6. That sentence hit harder than any weapon ever forged in a star. Confusion rippled outward. Even the synth pulsed in a rare flicker of emotion. Elias continued, voice steady. "We came here today to prove a point, not to take, but to show that we could have taken, that we had the patience, the will, the resolve. But the truth is, Calderon doesn't belong to any of us." He paused, eyes scanning the room. 30 years ago, I crashed there. My transport had been rerouted due to a solar anomaly. Emergency landing. Everyone else died on impact. Everyone but me. He glanced down at the floor, his voice softening. I survived in the northern basin of Calderon 6, beneath a canyon wall covered in shelf fungi. Massive, living things. They sensed my heat, my wounds, my fear, and they didn't attack. They didn't move. They didn't try to bond or absorb or dominate me. They just waited with me. 3 weeks of silence, no food, no shelter, just the breath of wind and the brush of sporefall. He looked up, while predators prowled, while storms passed. Those fungi remained, unchanging, and moved. A deep stillness settled over the chamber again. I believe they were sentient, or at least aware enough to choose not to harm, aware enough to share space, to let me live. And because they waited, I lived. He reached into his pocket and gently removed a small, sealed violet sample, glowing faintly gold in the dim light. I owe my life to this world not because it gave me something, but because it didn't take. He walked to the center of the chamber and set the vial on the floor beside the disc. My request is simple. Declare Calderon 6 a neutral sanctuary. No extraction, no terraforming, no settlements. Let it be what it already is, a place untouched by our hunger. Delegates whispered in their native frequencies. Some clicked in agreement. Others just stared. Elias stepped back, voice fading into something softer, something deeper. You want to know why humans are dangerous? It's not our weapon, not our ships, not even our stubbornness. He let the silence stretch again. It's our ability to become like the thing we admire most. He nodded toward the vial. To wait. To endure, to protect something without needing to possess it. He took a long breath, then asked quietly, almost as if to himself, if we can learn to become still, what else might we learn to become? And, with that, he turned and walked out. No fanfare, no victory speech. Just the sound of his footsteps echoing down a corridor lined with the stunned silence of the galaxy's most powerful species finally out. Learning what it meant to stop and listen. What would you have done in Elias's place? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Would you fight for Calderon 6, or protect it in silence?